Somewhere on the floor of the Baltic Sea, about 35 kilometers off the coast of what is now northern Poland, there is a ship. It is enormous, over 200 meters long, over 25,000 tons of steel, and at roughly 44 meters below the surface, it rests in near total darkness, completely still, completely silent, and almost completely intact. Polish navigation charts mark the spot with a simple label: shipwreck. But anyone who knows the history of that location, anyone who has studied what happened there on the night of January 30th, 1945, knows that label is deeply inadequate. Because this is not just a shipwreck, it is a tomb, and the Polish government has made it very clear: no one is allowed to open it. Part 1. A World Coming Apart. To understand what happened to that ship, you have to understand the world it existed in. And in January 1945, that world was in free fall. Germany had spent years tearing Europe apart. And now, the consequences were returning to German soil with Aussie ferocity that nobody in the Reich had ever expected to face. The Eastern Front had utterly collapsed. Soviet armies, massive, battle-hardened, and burning with years of accumulated fury over the atrocities they had witnessed and suffered, were advancing through Poland and into East Prussia at a speed that left the German command reeling. The Red Army that was now pouring westward was not the same force that had been caught off guard in 1941. These soldiers had fought their way back from the very edge of annihilation. They had watched their cities burn, their families die, their country bleed for 4 years, and stories spreading ahead of their advance, stories of massacres, of rape, of entire villages destroyed, were absolutely terrifying the German civilian population in the East. In East Prussia alone, there were more than 2.5 million people: farmers, teachers, factory workers, children who had grown up knowing nothing but war. When it became clear in January 1945 that the Soviets were breaking through in force, those people had a single, overwhelming thought: get out. The problem was that Adolf Hitler had spent months refusing to allow organized civilian evacuation. In his worldview, ordering people to flee was an admission of defeat, and that was simply unacceptable. So while military commanders had been quietly drawing up contingency plans, those plans had never been given the green light. When the Soviet offensive finally burst through in mid-January 1945, the people of East Prussia found themselves essentially abandoned, fleeing in disorganized terror through one of the worst winters in decades, toward the only hope remaining: the Baltic Sea. Columns of refugees stretched for kilometers across frozen roads. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Wagons broke through ice-covered lagoons. Families carried their possessions in whatever they could find: suitcases, blankets, baskets. The very old and the very young died from exposure in temperatures that dropped as low as -20 degrees Celsius. Reports filtered back from areas already overrun. The Soviets were not distinguishing between the guilty and the innocent. Civilians were being killed. Women were being attacked. If you were still east of the Soviet advance, your chances were not good. The only way out was the sea. Part 2. The ship that was supposed to represent a dream. The ship waiting in the harbor at Gotenhafen, the German name for what is now Gdynia, Poland, had not always been a military vessel. It had a very different origin, and understanding that origin is essential to understanding the full tragedy of what happened to it. When Adolf Hitler launched the Wilhelm Gustloff from a Hamburg shipyard on May 5th, 1937, the occasion was a spectacle of Nazi pageantry. Flags, swastika banners, thousands of cheering onlookers. The ship was the flagship of the German Labor Front's Kraft durch Freude, Strength Through Joy, organization, a program designed to provide affordable leisure activities for German workers. The idea was to show the German people and the watching world that the Third Reich took care of its citizens. Ocean cruises, previously the exclusive domain of the wealthy, would now be available to ordinary workers. The Gustloff was built specifically for this purpose, at 208.5 meters in length and over 25,000 gross tons. She was a genuine ocean liner. But unlike the traditional class-divided ships of the era, she had a single class. There were no first-class lounges and steerage compartments. Every passenger had an outer cabin with a porthole. There was a cinema, a theater, a gymnasium, a dance floor, and a tiled swimming pool. She could carry roughly 1,465 passengers and a crew of around 400 in genuine comfort. The ship was named for Wilhelm Gustloff, the head of the Nazi Party's Swiss branch, who had been assassinated by a Jewish medical student named David Frankfurter in February 1936. Hitler had personally decided on the naming while sitting next to Gustloff's widow at the memorial service. In that name, the ship carried the ideology that had set everything in motion. From 1938 until the outbreak of war in 1939, the Gustloff sailed on over a dozen voyages, to Madeira, to the Norwegian fjords, along the British coast, carrying hundreds of thousands of German workers on what the regime celebrated as a triumph of socialist achievement. In one of the more obscure historical footnotes, her very first unofficial voyage carried Austrians to vote on the annexation of Austria into Germany. When the war started, all of that ended. The Gustloff was requisitioned by the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine. She served briefly as a hospital ship during the Norwegian campaign in 1940, then was repainted naval gray and sent to the harbor at Gotenhafen, where she sat, largely unused, slowly deteriorating, for the next 4 years. For over 1,400 days, she served as a floating barracks for the 2nd Submarine Training Division, housing U-boat recruits and personnel. Her dance floors were converted to dormitories. Her elegant cabins became functional sleeping quarters. Her swimming pool, drained of water, became a makeshift bunk area. By January 1945, the Gustloff had not been seriously maintained for years. Her engines had sat largely idle. Lifeboats had been borrowed for other uses around the harbor and never replaced. Whatever she had once been, a symbol of leisure, a showpiece of the Reich's generosity, she was now something far more desperate, a last resort. Part 3. Operation Hannibal. The largest evacuation you've never heard of on January 21st, 1945, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz issued the code word that set Operation Hannibal in motion. Dönitz had been watching the Eastern Front deteriorate for months. He had drawn up plans quietly, carefully, knowing that Hitler would resist any move that looked like retreat. But when the Soviet offensive sliced through German lines with terrifying speed and reached the Baltic coast, cutting off East Prussia from the rest of Germany by land, the situation was beyond politics. It was survival. Operation Hannibal was the largest seaborne evacuation in history, larger ultimately than the famous British evacuation at Dunkirk in 1940, which is often cited as the great maritime rescue operation of the Second World War. Over the course of 15 weeks, somewhere between 800 and 900 ships, ranging from powerful naval cruisers down to small fishing boats, ferried an estimated 900,000 to 2 million people across the ice-choked Baltic Sea to the relative safety of Western Germany and German-occupied Denmark. Military personnel, civilians, the wounded, the elderly, children, anyone who could reach a port and fight their way aboard a vessel. This was the context aboard which the Wilhelm Gustloff was pressed back into service. After 4 years of sitting at dock, she was hastily refitted and designated as a transport ship. Anti-aircraft guns were installed on deck, and the refugees began boarding. What happened next was chaos dressed as procedure. Initially, authorities tried to issue and check boarding tickets. Priority was supposed to go to families with children. There were supposed to be orderly queues, organized manifests, controlled boarding procedures. But the reality of Gotenhafen in late January 1945, a city swollen with somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 desperate refugees, with Soviet artillery audible in the distance, made orderly procedure essentially impossible. People bribed their way on. People climbed ropes. People pushed, fought, begged. Soldiers were supposed to stand guard and maintain order, but they were overwhelmed. Women held their children up over the crowd. Men who had survived the frozen march from the east collapsed exhausted on deck. By the time the Gustloff prepared to depart on the morning of January 30th, 1945, she carried a number that nobody could fully account for. The official passenger manifest listed around 6,050 people. Researcher and survivor Heinz Schoen later spent decades compiling evidence that the true number was 10,582. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans estimates somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000. What historians agree on is this: the ship was built to safely transport approximately 1,465 passengers. Whatever the precise number, she was carrying 5 to 7 times her intended capacity, and among those tens of thousands of souls, an estimated 4,000 to 5,000 were children. There was also a command structure that nobody had quite resolved. 4 different captains were aboard, each with their own authority and opinion. Captain Friedrich Petersen was the civilian master. Lieutenant Commander Wilhelm Zahn commanded the naval detachment. There were 2 others with authority, and they disagreed fundamentally about how to proceed. Zahn wanted to move fast, at 15 knots, and to zigzag, making the ship a harder target for submarines. He also wanted to sail in deeper water, further from the coast. Petersen, worried about the ship's aged engines after years of inactivity, insisted on a maximum speed of 12 knots and rejected zigzagging as impractical for a vessel this size. He also made a navigation decision that would haunt the rescue operation. He chose not to hug the coastline, instead heading into open water. And then, one further fateful detail. To avoid a collision with other German vessels in the dark, Petersen ordered that the Gustloff's running lights be switched on. The red and starboard green navigation lights burned in the January night like a beacon. The Hansa, another evacuation liner that had departed at the same time, was forced to turn back with mechanical problems. One of the 2 torpedo boat escorts also developed engine trouble and returned to port. When the Gustloff finally passed beyond the breakwater at 12:30 in the afternoon of January 30th, 1945, she was essentially alone. 1 torpedo boat escort, the Loa, and open Baltic water ahead of her. At that exact moment, roughly 25 miles out to sea in those same waters, a Soviet submarine was hunting. Part 4. The Man in the Submarine. Alexander Ivanovich Marinesko was not, by any conventional definition, a model Soviet naval officer. Born in 1913 in Odessa to a Romanian father and Ukrainian mother, Marinesko was brilliant, reckless, and thoroughly undisciplined. By January 1945, he was the commander of the submarine S-13, a Stalinets-class vessel that had been commissioned in 1941. He was also, at that particular moment, in serious trouble. In early January, as his submarine sat docked at Hanko, Finland, Marinesko had disappeared for several days, vanishing into the pubs and company of a Swedish restaurant owner during what was supposed to be an operational deployment. The NKVD opened an investigation. The prospect of a court-martial loomed. In wartime Soviet, Russia desertion was not a matter that was handled gently. His superior officer, recognizing that S-13 was a top combat vessel and that Marinesko was genuinely gifted as a submariner, made a calculation. Rather than have Marinesko arrested and the submarine delayed, they sent him out on patrol with the implicit understanding that results would determine his fate. The S-13 left Hanko on January 11th, 1945, designated by some accounts as a penalty cruise. Marinesko needed to come back with something significant or face consequences. For nearly 3 weeks, he found nothing. The Baltic was cold, difficult, and increasingly full of German naval activity as Operation Hannibal ramped up. But landing a confirmed hit on a significant target had eluded him. On the night of January 30th, 1945, his sonar operator picked up something unusual, and then, surfacing cautiously, Marinesko looked through his periscope and saw something that must have seemed impossible: a brilliantly lit target. Enormous, moving slowly, its navigation lights burning in the darkness, the silhouette of a very large ship. What he was looking at, though he had no way of knowing it, was the Wilhelm Gustloff, carrying somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 human beings. He brought S-13 into position over the course of the next hour or so, maneuvering carefully. He fired 4 torpedoes. 1 jammed in the tube. 3 left the submarine. At precisely 9:16 in the evening, they hit. Part 5. 1 hour of hell. The first torpedo struck the bow, tearing through the crew's quarters. The second hit the drained swimming pool section amidships, where hundreds of members of the Women's Naval Auxiliary had been housed in the only space available. The third slammed into the engine room, cutting the ship's power almost immediately. In an instant, 10,000 people went from relative calm to absolute terror. The lights went out. In the darkness, the ship began to list sharply to port. The tilt was immediate and dramatic. Within minutes, it was steep enough to send people and objects sliding. Luggage, furniture, bodies all crashed toward the port side. Stairwells that had been crowded with people became chaos in seconds. Parents lost children in the darkness. Children screamed for parents who couldn't find them. The passageways, already dangerously overcrowded, became deadly. Survivor Hans Rittner, a naval doctor who was aboard that night, later described the moment with harrowing clarity. The ship lurching, the smell of carbon dioxide from fire extinguishers, the burning sensation in his lungs as he fought through the darkness. Only a handful of lifeboats could be lowered. The rest had frozen solid to their davits in temperatures that had dropped to somewhere between -10 and -18 degrees Celsius. The few boats that were freed were quickly overwhelmed or capsized by the desperate mass of people. When the ship's dramatic list swung the starboard side high into the air, the lifeboats on that side slammed into the hull and destroyed themselves as they fell. Those who made it into the water faced a different kind of death. The Baltic Sea in late January was approximately 4 degrees Celsius. At those temperatures, a person without a survival suit begins to lose consciousness within minutes. The water that night was dotted with ice floes. Survivors describe seeing people simply stop moving, their life jackets keeping them face up in the water as their bodies gave out. One 10-year-old survivor named Horst Voigt later described watching people, many of them children, trampled to death in the desperate rush up the stairwells. Witnesses described people jumping from the deck only to freeze solid before any rescue vessel could reach them. There were accounts of passengers turning their weapons on themselves rather than face the water. There were accounts of people fighting each other for space on overcrowded rafts. There were accounts of mothers throwing their children toward rescue vessels, hoping someone would catch them, knowing they themselves would not make it. At approximately 10:16 in the evening and roughly an hour after the torpedoes struck, the Wilhelm Gustloff slipped bow first beneath the surface of the Baltic Sea. 9 rescue vessels converged on the area throughout the night and into the following morning. The torpedo boat T-36 rescued 564 people. The Love, that single escort, pulled 472 from the water. The minesweeper M387 saved 98. Several other ships together saved a few hundred more. When the total was finally counted, 1,252 people had survived. 13 of those died afterward from exposure and injuries, which means that somewhere between 9,000 and 9,400 people died in approximately 1 hour. To understand the scale, the Titanic in 1912 killed approximately 1,500 people. The Lusitania in 1915 killed approximately 1,200. The Wilhelm Gustloff killed more than both of those combined. Multiplied, it is, by a significant margin, the deadliest maritime disaster in recorded history, and the bodies of most of those people, swept by Baltic currents and caught in the freezing cold, were never recovered. Some washed ashore along the Polish coastline for weeks afterward. Most did not. Part 6. The Man Who Did It and What Happened to Him. Alexander Marinesko returned to port having sunk the largest enemy ship ever destroyed by a Soviet submarine. His crew were treated as heroes. The expectation was that Marinesko himself would receive the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military honor in the country. He did not. His superiors had confirmed the scale of the sinking. They knew what he had done, but they also knew who he was, a man who had recently been under investigation for desertion, whose file with the NKVD was open, who had a history of drinking and insubordination. The official assessment was that Marinesko was not suitable to be a hero. He received the Order of the Red Banner, a lesser decoration. And then, following another patrol mission in the spring of 1945 that his superiors judged as unsatisfactory, he was demoted from Captain Third Class to Lieutenant and dishonorably discharged from the Soviet Navy in October 1945. The story did not end there. In 1949, Marinesko was arrested and convicted of theft from the institution he was working at and sentenced to 3 years in labor camps in the brutal Kolyma Gulag, where he lost his health permanently. He was eventually released, reinstated to his original rank in 1960, and given a small pension. In 1963, the same year, he finally received the traditional ceremony due a captain upon return from a mission, a ceremony 14 years late. He died of cancer at the age of 50. In 1990, 2.5 decades after his death, Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev posthumously awarded him the Hero of the Soviet Union. The question of whether the sinking was a war crime has been debated for decades. Legal and military opinion has largely concluded that the Gustloff, while primarily carrying civilians, was a legitimate military target. She was armed with anti-aircraft weapons. She carried nearly 1,000 military personnel, including submarine training crews, and she was not marked or operating as a protected hospital ship. The same conclusion was reached by the Institute of Maritime Law in Kiel, Germany. But none of that legal reasoning touches the fundamental moral weight of what happened. Nearly 5,000 of the people who died were children. Most of the rest were civilians who had no meaningful choice about where they were or what they were doing. The question of legality and the question of tragedy are two entirely different conversations. Part 7. What lies beneath the wreck of the Wilhelm Gustloff was not officially located until the post-war years, and it sat largely undisturbed for decades. In time, Polish divers began to explore the site. What they found there was deeply unsettling. The ship rests today at approximately 44 to 50 meters depth, deep enough that it sits in significant darkness, shallow enough that early diving technology could reach it. She came to rest on her port side and remained largely intact. The Baltic Sea is cold and has relatively low salinity compared to ocean waters, which slows the biological decay processes that would otherwise consume a wreck more quickly. This preservation has a deeply disturbing consequence. The wreck retains much of its character as a ship: corridors, cabins, stairwells, the shape of rooms. Before diving was restricted, some divers who explored the site brought back accounts that remained deeply chilling. One description compared the experience to swimming through a building that had collapsed inward, peering into rooms that still contained their contents, still shaped by the lives that had been inside them. A diver described finding a section of the debris field, created by later explosive, work done to collapse part of the superstructure, and realizing he was looking into what had once been the ship's interior, like a 3-story building that had just come apart. Author Ruta Sepetys, who wrote the acclaimed novel about the disaster Salt to the Sea, interviewed divers who told her the wreck was like swimming through a forest of black bones. She was told of a skeleton still wearing boots and a military belt, of children's shoes scattered across the seafloor, of a soldier's uniform still intact against the remains of a body. There is also the matter of what lies behind sealed compartments. When the Gustloff sank, several watertight sections were closed, either by crew following emergency procedures or by the pressure of sinking. The lower decks, where thousands of civilians and the Women's Naval Auxiliary had been packed into every available space, flooded rapidly when the torpedoes hit. Some areas of the ship are simply not accessible without cutting through. Steel. What is inside those sealed compartments? Nobody can say with precision. What can be said is that the ship sank with several thousand people still aboard, and that most of them were never recovered. Part 8. The War Grave. In 1994, Poland formally designated the wreck of the Wilhelm Gustloff as a war grave. The designation carries legal force. Under Polish maritime law, diving is strictly prohibited within a 500-meter radius of the site. Anchoring is forbidden. Fishing within the exclusion zone is forbidden. The removal of any object from the site is a criminal offense. Access for documentary or research purposes is possible only through a formal application to the Polish Maritime Office in Gdynia, which grants permits extremely sparingly. The reasons for this protection are not complicated. The wreck contains the remains of thousands of people. Many families of those who died have no grave to visit, no headstone, no marked place of mourning. The wreck is that place. 2. Disturb it. To cut open sealed compartments, to remove remains, to treat the interior as a salvage site, would be to desecrate a burial ground. This has not stopped everyone. Over the years, illegal diving has occurred. In one particularly grim episode from 2019, French military divers from a minesweeper were observed conducting operations in the restricted zone by a Polish patrol aircraft. They were questioned, but released without charge. And they had, in the process, discovered something that had been there for 7 years, without anyone knowing. In 2012, a Polish diver named Robert Schlecht had gone missing while diving in the Baltic. His companions at the time reported that they had been diving at a different wreck entirely, a nearby tanker called the Terra, and that Schlecht had simply disappeared. Despite a rescue operation, his body was never found. 7 years later, in 2019, divers from a group called Baltic Tech were conducting authorized photographic documentation of the Gustloff's exterior when they found something lodged between the hull sections. DNA testing confirmed what the evidence already strongly suggested. It was Robert Schlecht. He had died in 2012 while illegally diving the Gustloff. His companions had lied, claiming they were at the Terra to avoid the serious legal consequences of admitting they had been at the protected site. They had let 7 years pass, 7 years of a family waiting for answers, rather than confess. The story illustrates something important. The prohibition on diving at the Gustloff is not bureaucratic overreach. It is a genuine attempt to protect a site that is both a mass grave and an active danger. Visibility is often extremely poor. Ghost nets, lost fishing gear that drifts and entangles, are present in the area. The interior of the wreck is deeply complex, heavily deteriorated in sections, and extremely easy to get lost in. The Gustloff has already claimed at least one diver in the post-war era. There may well be others, and the wreck contains something that cannot be replaced or recovered. The last physical evidence of nearly 10,000 lives. Children's shoes, a family's porcelain. The military belt around a soldier who never came home. These things do not belong to treasure hunters. They belong to history, and they belong to the dead. Part 9. The silence around it. Here is the question that lingers over this entire story. Why has so few people heard of the Wilhelm Gustloff? The Titanic is one of the most famous disasters in human history. Films, documentaries, books, museums. The sinking of approximately 1,500 people in 1912 has become a permanent fixture in the cultural memory of the Western world. The Lusitania, sunk in 1915 with approximately 1,200 deaths, triggered a geopolitical crisis and has been endlessly analyzed. The Wilhelm Gustloff killed somewhere between 6 and 8 times as many people. It is, by any historical measure, the worst maritime disaster ever recorded, and yet for decades it barely appeared in textbooks, in museums, or in popular culture. There are several interlocking reasons for this silence, and they are worth understanding. The first is straightforwardly political. The Nazi regime, still functioning in January 1945, still controlling the German media, had no interest in publicizing the disaster. They were in the middle of an evacuation operation that depended on maintaining some level of order and morale. Acknowledging that 9,000 people had just died on one of the evacuation ships would have been catastrophic for morale. Some survivors later reported that when they tried to speak about what had happened, they received visits from authorities telling them to stop talking about a ship that had never sunk. The second reason is Cold War politics. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the dominant narrative, entirely justifiably, focused on the crimes of the Nazi regime, the liberation of the concentration camps, and the suffering inflicted on the peoples of Europe by Germany. Within that framework, the idea of German civilians as victims of the war was deeply uncomfortable, even distasteful. As curator of the Wilhelm Gustloff Museum, Edward Petruskevich has written, there was a powerful stigma around discussing German suffering in the war years, given the scale of what the Nazis had done to everyone else. The Gustloff was not the subject of Allied sympathy. It was simply another German casualty. The third reason is that within Germany itself, the trauma became deeply suppressed. German civilians had been on the losing side of a war their government had started with the explicit goal of ethnic domination and genocide. Claiming victimhood, even legitimate victimhood, felt morally impossible in that context. The dead of the Gustloff were not commemorated publicly. Their families mourned privately. The fourth reason is that the Soviet Union had every incentive to downplay the event. Marinesko had legally done exactly what he was supposed to do, attack enemy shipping. But the reality of 9,000 civilians dead, more than half of them children, was not the sort of thing the Soviet propaganda apparatus wished to highlight. The attack was known within naval circles but was not publicly celebrated. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s that serious historical discussion of the Gustloff disaster began to emerge, largely due to the decades-long research of Heinz Schoen, who had been 18 years old when the ship sank and had survived to dedicate most of his adult life to documenting what had happened. Schoen interviewed hundreds of survivors, compiled passenger lists, and fought to give the victims their historical acknowledgement. He died in April 2013. His ashes, per his wishes, were placed on the wreck in May of that year. One of the extremely rare authorized dives at the site. In more recent years, books like Catherine J. Prince's Death in the Baltic and novels like Ruta Sepetys' Salt to the Sea have brought wider attention to the disaster. Documentaries have been produced. The story is now more widely known than it was 20 years ago, but it still occupies a fraction of the cultural space it deserves. Part 10. What History Owes the Dead. It is worth asking what we owe to those who died in the Baltic on January 30th, 1945. They were not heroes of any conventional kind. They were not soldiers charging a hill or resistance fighters hiding in basements. They were overwhelmingly ordinary people. Most of them women, most of them children, who had been caught in the dying convulsions of a regime they had not necessarily supported, fleeing a retribution they had not personally inflicted. Among the dead were Lithuanians, Latvians, Poles, Estonians, and Croatians, people who had themselves been victims of the Nazi occupation. They were crammed together on a ship that was never meant to carry them, heading toward a safety that was denied to them before they could reach it. What they are owed is remembrance, accurate, honest, clear-eyed remembrance, not sympathy for the regime that put them in that position, not exculpation for the larger war that Germany started and prosecuted with extraordinary brutality, but the simple human acknowledgement that 9,000 people, most of them children, died in 1 hour in freezing water, and that their deaths matter. The ship sitting on the Baltic floor is a permanent physical reminder of that. Those sealed compartments, the ones that have never been opened, the ones the Polish authorities have decided should remain closed, they contain, in a sense, the last chapter of an untold story. Not treasure, not classified documents, not secrets of war, just people. People who boarded a ship on a cold January morning because they had no other choice, who heard their names called or fought their way to the gangway or were lifted up by strangers and passed over the side because someone somewhere showed a moment of mercy in the chaos. People who probably felt for a few hours like they might actually make it. They never arrived. They are still there. And the restraint of leaving those compartments sealed, of resisting the human impulse to open, to explore, to retrieve, is not negligence or bureaucracy. It is the last and most profound form of respect that can be given. The ship is a grave, and graves deserve to be left in peace. Closing, the Wilhelm Gustloff sits at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, 44 meters down, 35 kilometers from shore, in darkness and silence and cold. The Baltic's low salinity means decay is slow. The steel is deteriorating, slowly, year by year. Marine life has colonized the hull, but the ship's shape remains. The corridors remain. And within them, the stillness of a night in January 1945 remains preserved in ways that have unsettled every person who has ever been close enough to see it. There is no memorial stone above the waterline. There is no monument on the shore. There is just a note on a navigation chart, shipwreck. And beneath it, in darkness, the greatest maritime disaster in history is exactly where it fell. History's graveyards take many forms. Some of them are forests in Poland. Some of them are the beaches of Normandy. Some of them are the frozen mountains of Italy or the jungle clearings of the Pacific. And some of them are 35 kilometers out in the Baltic Sea, at the coordinates 55 degrees north, 17 degrees east, in 44 meters of water. All of them deserve the same thing: to be remembered. If you found this story as haunting and significant as I did, please leave a like on this video. It helps more people find histories like this one. And subscribe to WW2 Tales if you haven't already, because every week we come back here and do exactly this. Dig into the corners of the Second World War that most people have never heard of and try to tell the stories of the people who lived and died in them with the honesty and the depth they deserve. Thank you for watching.